Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to another episode of What's Up with Power. My name is Justin Wagner with Team ODZ, and this morning we've got a great episode for you talking about the dreaded FTP test. That's right. I use that word. It's probably on the banned word list. It's probably going to get changed into asterisks in game chat because it's that much of a bad word. Nobody wants to hear it, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to deep dive on it. We're going to talk about why it exists, what the different reasons for it are, what they're trying to approximate. And I want to hear from you when the last time you took an FTP test was. Are you due for one? How do you test? We're going to talk about it. That's what today's episode is all about. So we've got about 10 seconds here. You can hear the countdown for the group ride on Zwift to start. So that starts. Let me give people some instructions. 6. Okay. Okay, so. Okay, I'm going to type and present at the same time here. We're going to get this, everybody on the same page. There we go. Get the slides up on the screen. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, I think we are good to go. So, dreaded FTP test. This presentation is based on chapter 3 of training and racing with a power meter. If you don't have that book, I highly suggest getting it. It's I think brand new. The hard book's like $15 maybe or something on Amazon. Probably get it for like $3 used. Great resource if you want to know about training with power, if you want to be able to understand the ins and outs of what people are talking about. This is pretty much one of the best resources out there for getting that understanding. So we base a lot of our training off of that book. Highly recommended. So what are we going to talk about? So as we go through, this is kind of one of the beginning posts in the What's Up with Power series, beginning conversations. There's a few things you work through. First, we kind of talk about how people collect, how do you get your power data collected, and how do you understand that and whatnot. And we move through, okay, now that we've kind of understood power, so this is coming from the perspective of somebody who's never trained with power. And then that kind of leads into an FTP test, or understanding how you're going to base your training. So, and we'll kind of lead that into, okay, once you've got that base, that then leads into power-based training levels, okay? So that's kind of your 10,000 foot view. So something I want to say for somebody who's never used a power meter before, when you first get a power meter, you'd want to basically, I wouldn't recommend on your first day doing an FTP test. You're not going to have a good basis for how to pace that. You're not going to know what numbers to look at. I mean, I guess you could just do a blind 20-minute all out, not even looking at what the power numbers are generating. I guess that would be an accurate a way to do a test. But probably you're going to want to have some idea of pacing. So I would highly recommend, like, when you first get your power meter, try to get a sense for what the different power levels feel like. Ride with it on Zwift for a bit, outside, wherever that may be, and try to answer the question, what does 100 watts feel like? What does 200 watts feel like? So just get a little bit of a feeling for what that feels like. Maybe do it on the local hill outside, maybe box hill on Zwift. And do some of the rides you've normally done before, but add in the power meter data and analyze it. What do you notice, okay? When you got popped from the pack, what are your power numbers looking like, okay? These are the kind of things you want to start to analyze with the power meter, okay? And that'll lead you up to executing an FTP test well. And we'll talk about the different FTP tests that exist. There's a whole world of different testing protocols and methodologies, and we'll get into that, but that's kind of what's next. So first of all, you may say, okay, blah, 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 FTP test. What is FTP? We're not talking about file transfer protocol. Not the, well, we are on the internet, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about when we say FTP is functional threshold power, okay? So where does that come from? Well, it's actually, that name functional comes because it's something you can test on the road, okay? Compare this to lactate threshold power. Lactate threshold power is something you get from testing your lactate levels in your blood in a laboratory setting. And that's probably realistically what you would want to train at for your threshold. And what does that mean? Well, as you do endurance work, VO2, your body's generating lactate, okay? And your body has some natural ability to clear lactate. So there's gonna be a crossover point where you build up more than you can clear. That's called lactate threshold. And there's usually a power level that you can hold at that level, okay? So that's what probably we really want to understand, but not all of us have a blood lactate tester at our house that we can run this test on. And so okay, so we can't test our blood, but we've got a power meter. We do rides indoors, outdoors. We've got all this power data. It seems like we should be able to approximate it with this data we've got. And so that's exactly what functional threshold power is doing. It's basically, okay, you look at what power number comes out of these lactate threshold tests, and they've said, okay, that power is also generally the same power that that person can hold for 60 minutes. If somebody went out for a maximal 60-minute effort, their average power for 60 minutes generally going to be your lactate threshold power. Just because that's such a long duration, you're going to naturally have to, you're not going to be able to push yourself above your lactate threshold because you'll just build up too much lactate in that duration. So extend that one more step. Nobody likes doing an all-out 60-minute effort. It's a long time. It's brutal. It's painful. So there's yet another approximation thrown on top of that where you basically say, okay, for 20 minutes, your best 20-minute effort, generally your 60-minute effort is approximately 95% of that, okay? Not everyone's the same there, but that's most software automatically finding your FTP. I wouldn't say all, but I'd say most is using that method where they basically take, okay, what's your best 20-minute power effort, take 95% of that, and that's what they will give you for an FTP, okay? So that was a long explanation of what FTP is. That's okay. That's what you're here for, is the nuts and bolts understanding. That's what we're all about. So, okay. So we started from blood lactate, 60-minute test, 20-minute test. Okay, now we're looking at on the screen a very common testing protocol for FTP. Probably one of the a very common one you'll find in Swift. I'm sure Trainer Road has a version. Any training platform is going to have a version of an FTP test very similar to this, where you get a warm-up period, then you've got some just quick intervals to activate the legs, let that dissipate out a little bit. Then they've got a 5-minute, short 5-minute effort to open it up even more. You back off for a while, recover from that, and then then you wind up for 20-minute effort, where the goal of that 20 minutes is to get the highest average power possible. Okay, so you can see on the screen that green box, it's got the wavy line. That's how they show it in Zwift. That's basically, they're not going to give you a wattage target. You're just going to do as much as you can for that 20 minutes. So that's kind of how the test rolls out. You do 20 minutes. They'll capture your average power for that 20-minute time frame, take 95% of it, and they'll say, good job, congratulations, your FTP is that number. Okay, so that's probably your bread and butter. It's common. Doesn't mean everyone likes it. It means it's the simplest to understand. It's pretty convenient. Doesn't mean it's the best for sure. I mean, we could argue what's the best for ages. And anyway, that's the test. So now let's look at that and say, what are some of the alternatives? And this is where, if you've got some alternative methods that you use for testing, I'd love to hear it in the comments. We will get to a question and answer session where we'll discuss those. So if you want to type those out now, or maybe 5 minutes away from Q&A, and we'll dig into some of those and talk about what each of you guys use. So, okay, alternative. We talked about this one, actual lactate measurement. Okay, that requires either a lab or a blood lactate tester. Okay, not everyone has that. Yet another piece of equipment to have. So, although if that is some very good data if you had that. Another testing protocol uses 2 different 8-minute all-out efforts. Okay, so total work is only 16 minutes, and you get a break in between it. And the way they take your FTP from that is they take your combined average of the 2 efforts, and they knock it down. 90% of that is what they're going to say, okay, this is what your FTP is. Now, somebody who's got a very strong VO2 max, long 8-minute VO2 max, may end up with a higher power number in this 2 by 8 minute effort test, because obviously you're testing at that shorter duration. Somebody who's not so great at shorter efforts, their number might not be 90%, it might be higher, but it's just a different method that gets used. If it works for you, that's fine. And all of these testing protocols, right? There's so many variations. The underlying factor for an individual is be consistent. Whatever method you end up using, be consistent. That's the whole point of power training, is consistency, is data that's not skewed and that it's objective. You can know when you're making progress, right? So consistent testing protocols or regimes are totally what we're looking for in that. There's also other methods of, I believe in the Garmin App Store, there's Xert. You've probably heard of Xert. I'm not sure I pronounced it correctly, but they have an app that will essentially look at any ride, or it'll live during the ride, tell you what they think your FTP is based on what you did in that ride. And they're doing it, it doesn't require 20 minutes of data, so they've got something more complicated than just ride your heart out for 20 minutes going on. Also, WKO4 will look at all of your historical performances and analyze that with some greater scrutiny and statistical methods applied to it to give you what they call their modeled FTP. Now, this method of just looking at historical data requires, obviously, that you've pushed yourself to a limit. Otherwise, you may just be, may think your threshold is below what it actually is. If you've never actually gone all out, right? It's going to assume that it's somewhere in there you've hit your limit. So these types of things where you don't do a specific test, but you do hard efforts, are valid as long as you are hitting a limit there, or pushing yourself maybe to a breaking point or whatever it may be. You're going to need some hard efforts for those type of systems to work. Okay. So we get our FTP. What does that lead to? Structured training. Okay. This method of structured training the classical case of structured training has zones that are all based on some percentage of your threshold power, be that lactate threshold or functional threshold power. And now, so here's some zones. I'm not going to go through them. Each of the zones has some different expected adaptations of the body. You can see here in the higher sprint zones, you're working on different parts of your body than what you do for endurance. And active recovery shouldn't be working on anything other than blood flow. So endurance is doing something different than sprints. Okay, that can make sense, right? We expect that. But one of the things I want to say is that, so knowing your FTP is vital, but probably even more vital is understanding your entire power curve. This is something that Sufferfest is hitting on very specifically. They've got a lot of marketing around this, what they call 4DP, four-dimensional power, where they're focusing on 4 different power zones rather than just one. Because essentially knowing your FTP is looking at either your 20-minute power or your 60-minute power. 4DP looks at 5-minute, 1-minute, 5-second, and 20-minute, okay? Well, I mean, in reality, that power curve, what's called your maximal power curve, or how much power you can hold for how much time, it's a continuous thing, right? There's some value associated with how hard you can go for 13 seconds, which may be different from what you can hold for 26 seconds. Now, depending on what you're training for, there may be a very specific one of those that you want to nail. Like, let's say you're doing a race that has laps and there's a 3-minute long climb in there. Well, you're probably going to want to be really good at VO2 and nail and train for 3-minute effort consistently so you can improve your 3-minute effort. Okay, so knowing what you can do for 3 minutes and training to that is the right approach. That's different than saying, okay, a 3-minute VO2 effort is this percentage of my FTP, because not everyone's VO2 is the same percentage of FTP. So it's getting kind of into, really nerdy levels of power understanding, but that's really what's going on. And in the end, test consistently, right? Be consistent with yourself, use the same analysis, use the same testing protocols, whatever it may be, because then you want to trust the test. So then you can update your training, or update your FTP in your training systems that'll generate workouts with different targets then for you, and track your fitness and freshness and fatigue based on that FTP. Okay. All right, so I've talked a lot, and I think we are now to the Q&A session. I'm going to go through the Facebook comments here, and we're going to have a discussion on them. If you've got questions about what we talked about, curious about maybe testing protocol you use, what its effectiveness is, let it fly in the comments. I'm going to take a drink, and we're going to head right over there. Folks here, okay, so if I do a short race, can you use that for your FTP? Asks Steve Walker. Good question. I'm going to say that depends on the nature of that short race. But let's say you've got a race that basically is right on somewhere around 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, but somewhere close to 20 minutes. I personally actually like that method where you're doing a race against other people, trying to push yourself there. Now, honestly, a race effort is going to be different than an effort where you're trying to hold maximal average power, because races may include surges, attacks, recovery, something that when you're doing the FTP test, you may not do. Now, okay, so sure, your strategy for it may not be the same, but if you are going all out for that 20 minutes, I'd say that using a race effort for 20 minutes is certainly a valid approach, and something that you could look at over time. A lot of people use that method because it's way more motivating to do a shorter-ish race on Zwift than it is to sit down by yourself and just do an FTP test. So yeah, I think that's definitely a commonly used method. You're going to find, certainly it's going to be harder to have consistency from one of those 20-minute races to another because the race dynamics may change, who you're racing against. So you're going to lose a little bit of consistency, but it's pretty valid because it's, that's I don't know, that extra motivation I find useful actually in my testing. So anyway, we've gone on that. So Andy Jenner, is the 5-minute effort not got some specific physiological impact to reduce your anaerobic fuel tank and the effect it has in the FTP test? Good question. So he was referring to the standard FTP test. It does some few short efforts and it has a 5-minute block. It very well may be that, Andy. So I think I may have mentioned it was just to open up the legs more. It might be more to actually get you into a fatigue state, because that 5-minute, you'll find doing the FTP test, that 5-minute block before the 20-minute block is pretty brutal actually. And I think that's meant, as Andy is saying, to reduce some of your anaerobic capacity so that you're not having extra anaerobic capacity thrown into your 20-minute effort. Good point. As well as why a short race might also be higher 20-minute power than FTP test. Yeah, because you've got some of that anaerobic power. So, yep. So Andy's pointing out here, there definitely are different testing protocols. Okay, Jim Ham says, was the original FTP theory research built around or for time trialists? I'd say the original theory for FTP comes from the concept of blood lactate clearing, okay? So we kind of touched this at the beginning, but your body generates lactate at some rate, and it can clear it at some rate. There's a threshold there where you can't clear the lactate as fast as you can generate it, and you won't be able to hold that effort, right? You'll eventually have too much lactate, and you'll have to back off. That's the theory originally behind FTP, which has then been approximate, and that's tested based on testing your blood, lactate levels in your blood. And that's been approximated back towards 20-minute tests or 60-minute tests based on empirical evidence of where your lactate thresholds are. Say somebody who's done a lactate threshold test, and you look at where does that power lie in their functionally, where do they perform in time range? So either a 20-minute or a 60-minute effort. So yeah, certainly it does feel though like, okay, obviously that number of what your lactate clearing ability, that's very much a steady state, long kind of deal, right? We're not talking about tacking at all. We're talking about long-term lactate buildup in the muscles and clearing it. And that certainly is, the same thing applies for shorter efforts, but I guess, so I think, yeah, you kind of definitely feels like it's, a 20 or 60-minute number is maybe more appropriate to somebody who's attacking a time trial than maybe somebody who's drafting in the pack and coming out and punching for 5 minutes. So you have a good point there that what you train for and what's important to you may not be your 20-minute number. It may be something different. It just depends on what your current goals and targets are, what you train towards. And That might be a 60-minute TT. It might be a 10-minute TT. Might be a crit. You know, so a good point. So yeah, although one thing we do want to say is that raising the level at which your body is able to clear lactate, so making it so that you have a higher lactate threshold, so you can hold more power at your threshold of where your body can't clear lactate fast enough, that does a couple things. It's kind of like this, the rising tide affects all ships. So as you raise that lactate level, lactate threshold, you do a couple things. You make it so that, let's say you move your lactate threshold from 250 to 275 watts. That means now at 250 watts, you actually are getting more recovery, right, than you would have previously. So you can actually recover at those levels you were before, and below the recovery gets even faster. So you're doing a couple things. You're improving your ability to recover mid-race, which may help you then be ready to go for a shorter effort. So it helps you, you're drafting, get a lot more recovery in the draft if you've got a higher threshold, right? So while I just said that, you know, let's say you're planning on nailing that 3-minute climb and leaving everyone in the dust, if you only train for your 3-minute power and you don't focus on your threshold, you may not be recovered enough by the time that 3-minute hill comes around to really attack out of the pack and go for it. You might be thinking, holy cow, I'm not getting any recovery. Somebody's really got the pace going high, and I can't even do anything about it. So that's where threshold comes into play for even if your target isn't a long time trial, it helps you recover faster in the pack with that higher threshold power. Okay. Very good questions. And again, this all comes back to, you know, what are we training for? What's your goals and objectives, right? It's always a good target, if you don't know anything else, to target a better FTP. You know, that's kind of your fallback. Get nothing from that, you know, obviously. And so improving your FTP is always a good decision. And second of all, being consistent in how you test whether or not that threshold has improved is important. It's something that will help you keep your sanity in looking at your data if you're fairly consistent, or you know how to say, okay, well, I can't really compare this apples to apples because these, you know, if you're just using, like, let's say the 20-minute race, right? The race may play out differently. Say, okay, I know my power is going to be a little bit lower or more punchy because the race played out like this, so, you know, I'm not going to take it as absolute, you know, truth, whatever number comes from that. But I know that if it's within, say, 5% or something, okay, we're still within the realm. We don't necessarily need to back down our FTP for training. We may not need to improve it. But if you're, you know, constantly performing, let's say, 5% over what your current FTP test is in those, then you get a pretty good indication. Okay, yeah, we can train to the next level of FTP, increase that. So get some water in me here. So we're about wrapping it up here. We've got about 2 minutes left in the group ride. I want to thank everyone for coming, bringing into the conversation your questions. We will have the recording available. If, let's say, you just showed up late, you didn't catch the whole session, this will be distributed via podcast. It'll be on YouTube for replay, here on Facebook for replay, and it'll be in the forum for discussion. So whatever method works best for you to consume that. The podcast you can find on any podcast channel. Just search for the Endurance Lab, and you'll find it there. It's brought into the mix with the Coach's Corner, In the Feed Zone, Skills and Drills. Maybe Skills and Drills isn't on the podcast. So that's handy if you wanted to listen in when you're driving to work and you can't really watch a video or something. And there's also a whole playlist of all the previous episodes on YouTube. So if you wanted to cross-reference, find quick ones, go back, rewatch them, they're all available there. And if you have any questions on previous episodes, probably the best place to ask those is on the forum, which is discuss.endurancelab.fit. Okay, and we'll drop a link to that here in the comments. Actually, Andy, hopefully if you're still watching, maybe he's not, I can drop it in, find the forum, and we've got all the historical episodes there. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. We're going to wrap this up. We'll be on next week, 6:30 a.m. Pacific, 9:30 a.m. Eastern, and whatever that is in the UK. And I think we're getting close to, but haven't quite hit daylight savings in the next couple weeks. So be aware of that. That may mess with things as the US changes time zones before UK or vice versa. There's always a couple week of weirdness, but the start time is based on Pacific Coast time in the US. So be aware of that. And with that, we're gonna bring down the live stream, say thank you so much for coming, and hope you're able to join us on the next episode of What's Up with Power.